Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to be talking about Fantasy Flight Games' new Genesys book, which is the Genesys Advanced Player Guide. This is a very important source book, and the reason why is Genesys is a really important tabletop role-playing game. So you have Fantasy Flight Games. Fantasy Flight Games makes some of the best tabletop role-playing games that are on the shelves today. They're number one absolute flagship product for Fantasy Flight Games when it comes to tabletop role-playing games is the Star Wars tabletop role-playing games. It brought huge innovation to the tabletop role-playing game scene. So what did it do? It brought in narrative dice. That's awesome. It also brought in taking a world and cutting it into multiple equally useful core rule books. I've seen almost no other tabletop role-playing game has done this. Right now you have Age of Rebellion, Edge of the Empire? And then there's Force and Destiny, right? So there's 3 core rule books for Star Wars, right? And also, Fantasy Flight Games just does this tremendous job of making these amazing, beautiful source books for Star Wars, which is really taking Star Wars elements and making very specific core mechanics for them, all that work with the narrative dice system. The narrative dice system is really exciting. It has birthed another game that runs on narrative dice, which is the Legends of the Five Rings. Also runs on its own specific custom set of narrative dice. Really incredible. Very similar to Star Wars, but it is its own unique tabletop role-playing game system. Now let's talk about Genesys. Genesys is the generic narrative dice game. So it also has its own dice, right? So basically now there are 3 games, all from Fantasy Flight Games, that all use different dice, right? So basically, you have the Legend of the Five Rings narrative dice, you have the Star Wars narrative dice, and you have the Genesys narrative dice, which every single one of these has fundamentally different symbols on them, even though the mechanics are quite similar, right? But just to be clear, Legends of the Five Rings really does take that off into a new direction, and the idea of narrative dice is there in Legends of the Five Rings, but Legends of the Five Rings is quite unique, right? So Fantasy Flight Games is really doubling down on the idea of narrative dice. They really kind of own this as a concept. Almost, I do not know a single other tabletop role-playing game that has done their own version of narrative dice, right? So right now, FFG is out there on their own, but Genesys is really special. So if you buy the Genesys core rulebook, right, which has been out for about 2 years now, right? If you get that book, you can run anything you want, right? You can run fantasy games, you can run sci-fi games, you can run licensed property. You don't need permission. Like, for instance, the old 1980s toy show called Mask, right? I have what I need. I have a good bit of what I need in I can run a Mask game using the Genesys core rulebook, okay? Now, I might have to build some of the functionality myself in that game because the core rulebook is a little bit limited, but I generally have everything I need, and the reality is the Genesys core rulebook is very powerful, and it offers multiple settings. There's a fantasy setting in there. There is a sci-fi setting in there. They even use and there's quite a few other interesting ones, right? So let's talk about the Genesys Advanced Player's Guide and why it's important. It is very important because it is the Genesys system growing, and specifically Fantasy Flight Games specifically helping players who are saying, I want to build my own worlds. I want to run my own games, my own custom games. I want to run Mad Max Fury Road, right? Whatever it is. So skinning licensed properties without having to get permission and have a licensed game. That's very interesting. And then also custom. This came out of my own heart, my own mind. And so the Advanced Player's Guide is really important because it makes it even easier for those game masters to do this. And this is incredibly important too, right? Because right now, Dungeons & Dragons is forbidding this at the industry level, right? So right now there is no DMG2 for 5th edition. There is no advanced player's guide for Dungeons and Dragons. There's no 5e Unearthed Arcana. It doesn't exist, right? There is no PHB2 for 5th edition, and basically Dungeons and Dragons is like DMG is all you get. You're not going to get any more generic options. You're not if you are interested in building your own worlds, you can go take a long walk off a short pier, because we're not building anything more for you, right? It's important, right? But FFG is saying no. We are going to equip those game masters, and we are going to equip those players. So what is in the Advanced Player's Guide? Well, there's a lot more character types. There are new settings, all of which are very generic, so that you can take what's there, use what you like, and then reskin it, right? So there are 3 new settings. There's Age of Myth, which is all about mythologies and pantheons, right? Like the Greek mythology, and, Zeus and Mars and those different mythological deities, right? So you have Age of Myth. You also have Monster World, which is an 1800s gothic horror setting. So you could play a Jack the Ripper game with that, hunting Jack the Ripper type game. You could even play a werewolf type game where, some of your characters are werewolves, vampires, all that kind of thing. Very, very interesting. And last is post-apocalyptic. And this, you could absolutely run your own Mad Max Fury Road game with this. And in addition to that, there are very robust rules in this game for building vehicles, which was not in the first game, right? And it was missing. It was a nice to have, but it's right here. And so this makes the Genesys tabletop role-playing game, that generic setting where you can use narrative dice to build any world you actually want. It makes it a much more robust game, and it makes it easier to build these kind of things. Also, it allows you very easily now to do mecha games, which is great. That means you can run, BattleTech you could run a BattleTech game with the narrative dice. You could run your own special designed power armor or mecha type game, and that is really cool and unique. I am very excited about this book. I really think this is a wonderful decision from Fantasy Flight Games. And one of the things it really points out is game design is not just the rules you're putting in books. Game design is increasingly, what are the books your company is choosing to create? Who will be fed and who will be starved, right? This is a huge question over on the Dungeons & Dragons side. And it's really interesting decisions that Fantasy Flight Games is making. I would love to hear your opinion on this. Do you think that the Genesis that Fantasy Flight Games is right, and that we should be really feeding game masters who want to create their own worlds? Or do you think that Dungeons & Dragons is right, that all they get is the DMG and you starve them 5-6 years into your edition? Really, really interesting question. I'd love to hear your opinion. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.